Hey everyone. For this video, I'm going to talk about Steven Pinker. More specifically, I'm going to talk about optimism, which is something that Pinker goes hand in hand with. Steven Pinker is a Canadian psychologist, which there's never been a bad one of those. He's a neuroscientist and a linguist at Harvard University, but that isn't why he's famous. Instead, his fame comes from his controversial and dangerous claims that everything is good, actually. That's it? Really? Nothing else. What's that? There's no one else in the room and I'm adding those camera movements in post? Okay then.
Don't you worry, you're in decline. Don't you worry, you're doing fine.
So, admittedly, Steven Pinker seems on the surface like a bit of an odd person for me to make a video about. I was joking earlier, but in a lot of ways, Pinker presents himself as a kind of benign, good version of Jordan Peterson. I know Jordan Peterson and his fans put up a big fight whenever he gets called a conservative, but come on. I mean, I have a pretty difficult time believing that Jordan Peterson ever voted for Justin Trudeau, but Steven Pinker, on the other hand, if he is still able to vote in Canada, probably did. He is an honest-to-God, blue-check certified orange man bad liberal. Also, while Jordan Peterson has certainly enjoyed plenty of success and access to mainstream audiences, I'd argue that there is an extent to which Peterson has and plays into this image of him as a bit of an anti-establishment boogeyman. Pinker, on the other hand, is the type of guy who gets invited to give TED Talks, is highly celebrated in his field, was named one of Time magazine's top 100 most influential people, and is everyone's favorite billionaire philanthropist Bill Gates' favorite writer. Now, it's worth noting that Pinker does definitely have something of a dark side in spite of those liberal credentials. For someone supposedly so liberal, it's a little odd that he was, for instance, a vocal supporter of James Damore, the former Google employee who was fired for writing a memo arguing that women should not be programmers because of biological differences. Speaking of biological differences, Pinker also argues on some bell curve shit that Ashkenazi Jews, as a matter of genetics, have above average IQs, and while he doesn't go so far as to talk about which groups have lower IQs, once that door's open, you can't really close it. Pinker is also friends with Jordan Peterson and is a peripheral member of the intellectual dark web. Also, speaking of close friends, Pinker was extremely close with Jeffrey Epstein. Weirdly, he doesn't seem particularly proud of that connection. He now automatically blocks anyone on Twitter who uses Epstein's name in his mentions, myself included. I swear, I was just trying to wish him my condolences on the anniversary of his very close friend's death. Anyway, the reason for all of Pinker's fame has been his two most recent books, The Better Angels of Our Nature and Enlightenment Now. In these books and his many subsequent media appearances, Pinker argues that the world has been drastically improved thanks to the Enlightenment and, more recently, neoliberal capitalism. Now, when it comes to the Enlightenment, Pinker says some wild shit. The Enlightenment was an extremely important time period when a great number of key scientific, philosophical, and political revolutions happened across Europe. And I'm not planning to shit all over it, but also, I think Pinker really exaggerates how important it was. For example, at one point, Pinker writes,
"Thinkers such as Kant, Baruch Spinoza, Thomas Hobbes, David Hume, and Adam Smith were inquisitive psychologists and all too aware of our irrational passions and foibles. They insisted that it was only by calling out the common source of folly that we could hope to overcome them.
And look, I don't have a huge problem with Pinker as a psychologist being stoked about how people were asking questions about how our minds worked 300 years ago. The problem is that he acts as though no one had ever asked about how the human mind works until Kant came along. There's also the way Pinker uses a very broad definition of what counts as the Enlightenment. For instance, he includes the founding fathers of America. This isn't totally wrong by any stretch. They were, at the very least, products of the Enlightenment. But this tends to lead to other issues when he, for instance, credits the Enlightenment with the abolition of slavery. He also pretty notably doesn't include Karl Marx. This isn't totally wrong. You can very reasonably argue that Marx was a product rather than a part of the Enlightenment. But again, this isn't a distinction that seems to matter to Pinker when he's talking about the founding fathers. Also, throughout the entire book, Pinker insists on capitalizing the word Enlightenment like a total fucking nerd. Then we get to the more contemporary stuff about neoliberalism. First of all, Pinker dismisses any criticisms of the ideas he espouses with just a wild amount of anti-intellectualism.
If you think knowledge can solve problems, then you have a blind faith and quasi-religious belief in the outmoded superstition and false premise of the myth of the onward march of inevitable progress. You are a cheerleader for vulgar American can-doism, with the rah-rah spirit of boardroom ideology, Silicon Valley, and the Chamber of Commerce. You are a practitioner of Whig history, a naive optimist, a Pollyanna, and of course, a Pangloss. Epithets aside, the idea that the world is getting better than it was, and can get better still, fell out of fashion among the clerisy long ago. In The Idea of Decline in Western History, Arthur Herman shows that prophets of doom are the all-stars of the liberal arts curriculum, including Nietzsche, Arthur Schopenhauer, Martin Heidegger, Theodor Adorno, Walter Benjamin, Herbert Marcuse, Jean-Paul Sartre, Frantz Fanon, Michel Foucault, Edward Said, Cornel West, and a chorus of eco-pessimists.
Pretty bold of him to give a reading list of people much smarter than him. The majority of Enlightenment now, and most of Pinker's media appearances, are spent going through the data to empirically demonstrate that the world has gotten better, and this is where things start to go a bit off the rails. For example, check out Pinker's TED Talk, where he shows how the world has gotten better through a series of graphs, but he uses wildly different time periods for each of his points so that the data looks the same on each graph.
200 years ago, 90% of the world's population subsisted in extreme poverty. Today, fewer than 10% of people do. For most of human history, the powerful states and empires were pretty much always at war with each other, and peace was a mere interlude between wars. Today, they are never at war with each other. The annual rate of war has fallen from about 22 per 100,000 per year in the early 50s to 1.2 today. Homicide rates plunge whenever anarchy and the code of vendetta are replaced by the rule of law. It happened when feudal Europe was brought under the control of centralized kingdoms. 250 years ago, in the richest countries of the world, a third of the children did not live to see their 5th birthday. Before the 17th century, no more than 15% of Europeans could read or write. Europe and the United States achieved universal literacy by the middle of the 20th century, and the rest of the world is catching up. Thanks to the universal penetration of running water and electricity in the developed world.
But bad graphs aside, I don't have a huge problem with Pinker's points about how technology has improved the world. I don't totally share his enthusiasm about things like, say, the free market handling the distribution of vaccines to the global south, but I think it is pretty uncontroversial that it's better to be born now with access to modern medical technology than 500 years ago. The problem is when Pinker goes into areas like economics, where he's either wrong or incredibly dishonest. When Pinker talks about poverty, he employs a bit of a magic trick to disguise the actual numbers. Pinker's claims that poverty has been all but eliminated come from the UN's Millennium Development Project. This was a project designed to dramatically reduce global poverty by 2015. Have you ever heard that factoid that thanks to neoliberal economics, poverty has been cut in half? This is where that comes from. But the problem is, that's all it's there for. The Millennium Development Project was less interested in actually reducing poverty and more interested in saying that they had. When it was clear that their objectives couldn't be met, they'd quietly move the goalposts. An example of this is their definition of absolute poverty. The Millennium Development Project uses $1.90 US per day as their definition of poverty, and by that metric, the number of people in poverty has dramatically declined, so much so that there are actually fewer people living on $1.90 than there are people who are currently starving to death. Now, you or I might call that a woefully inadequate definition of poverty, but the Millennium Development Project calls that mission accomplished. When you use a higher amount, like $5 or $7 a day, a more realistic amount for people to live off of, it doesn't look like poverty has disappeared at all.
Right. Put the magic away. Bloody breadtubers, honestly. Hi everyone, I'm back for another video in my series on breadtube and economics. This time I'll be covering Pound Shop Big Joel, We're in Hell, and, well, where to start, honestly. First, the poverty decline is not just a statistical illusion. The proportion of poor in the world has fallen pretty much whichever line you use, though it's also clear that the decline gets less impressive the higher the line. According to the World Bank's poverty calculator on their website, between 1981 and 2019, at $1.90 a day, the proportion under the global poverty line dropped from 43 to 9%. At $4 a day, the proportion went from 62 to 31%. At $7.40 a day, it went from 71 to 52%. At $15 a day, it went from 81 to 72%. Now, there are a couple of ways you can splice the data to make the poverty decline seem less impressive. First, if you use the absolute number of poor people in the world rather than the proportion, you get an increase in poverty at higher poverty lines, like $7.40 a day. The global population has grown, and with it, the number of poor people. Secondly, if you omit China and other high-performing economies, the decline in poverty is very small, though not entirely gone, at higher poverty lines. These countries have pursued different policies to the ones favoured by neoliberals such as Steven Pinker. But should we do these things? Which is the most honest measure of poverty? Fortunately, Sam isn't the only person who is confused here. There was an interview where Mehdi Hassan challenged Steven Pinker on his understanding of the numbers, and Pinker seemed kind of under-equipped to address the points.
Well, let's take global poverty.
Yeah.
You have a chapter in the book on prosperity. You want to make the case that the world is more prosperous and less poor than ever before, and you point to data showing the number of people living on the extreme poverty line, as defined by the World Bank today at $1.90 a day, is down from 2 billion in 1990 to 700 million in 2015. The world is becoming middle class, you say. But surely you know, I know you know, because you're a very clever, well-qualified guy, that there are numerous studies and a number of scholars who dispute that poverty measure as arbitrary, as inaccurate, that in reality, to quote from a recent academic paper by an anthropologist at the LSE, quote, around 4 billion people remain in poverty today, around 2 billion remain hungry, more than ever before in history.
That completely irrelevant to which way the numbers have gone. Of course, the definition of extreme poverty is going to be arbitrary. If you make it higher, then more people will be in poverty. If you make it lower, fewer people.
Exactly.
But no matter what cutoff you set, the direction is downward.
That's not true. That's
yes,
not,
it is.
If you look at the work done by Jason Hickel at the LSE, if you take a poverty line of $5, 1 billion people have been added to the number of people on that poverty measure since 1981. The trend shows the exact opposite when you move it to $5 a day.
In terms of the proportion of people in poverty by that criterion?
No, the sheer number of people.
Yes,
1 billion people have been added to the poverty total
yes, but,
since 1981.
Yes, but billions of people have been added to the world as a whole. What's relevant is the proportion.
But you also use absolute numbers in your book. You say it's gone down from 2 billion to 700 million.
Well, I note that by at least the most widely accepted definition of extreme poverty, it's interesting that the absolute numbers have declined as well. But the main point is the proportion, because more people have been added, so anything is going to increase.
You say widely accepted, but this is my point. You don't acknowledge in the book, there's no caveats where you say, for example, Professor Lant Pritchett, Harvard colleague of yours, a development economist who studies this stuff, says the poverty line shouldn't be $1.90, it should be $12, $15 a day. And when you make that simple statistical change, the entire picture of poverty changes, and the arguments in your book basically fall apart, do they not?
No, I don't think so.
In my video, I discuss the behaviour of poverty using these different measures, but I also look at where the poverty data come from. What does it mean to be in poverty? And how do we know which poverty cutoff to use? Which people in which times and places are excluded from the data? And what does this mean for how we interpret a graph like this, showing poverty declining over time and much beloved by Steven Pinker and Bill Gates?
Hey, what the hell's going on?
Oh, I didn't get rich by writing a lot of checks.
Watch my video if you want to avoid embarrassing yourself, like seemingly all Canadians when they talk about this. My video also covers Steven Pinker on the subject of inequality, and let me tell you, he really butchers this one. He's committed to the view that inequality is not inherently bad, which requires some very one-sided readings of well-known studies which show that it is, in fact, bad, both in how it has come about and in its consequences. For example, he paints super-rich individuals as entrepreneurs and artists like J.K. Rowling, who have created things people value and have been rewarded for doing so. He fails to mention deliberate policy changes over the past few decades which have produced today's ultra-rich individuals. One example are intellectual property laws, which have expanded hugely in scope and length over the past few decades. As people and individuals are not allowed to use certain ideas or technologies, except possibly by paying, this has created monopolies and increased the prices of things like drugs and software for the rest of us, increasing inequality both within countries and globally. But if Pinker pointed this out, Bill Gates, arguably the biggest beneficiary of intellectual property in the world, just might not endorse the book.
Dude, why are you acting like you're correcting me? I didn't even get anything wrong.
But you weren't as thorough as you should have been, which is even worse.
How is that worse?
If you want to learn more about poverty and inequality and how Pinker gets them wrong, as well as right on occasion, then come and check out my video. It might be a little drier than Sam's, but at least I know that the word data is plural.
Man, fuck that guy. Okay, I'm back in my bedroom. We're done with the magic eye bit. This is just gonna be some classic We're in Hell from here on out. Nothing fancy. Let's all just have a nice drink and relax. Now, the part of Pinker's work that I'd most like to focus on is his writing on happiness. That's right, you optimists have had it too good for too long, or at least you think you have. In Enlightenment Now, Pinker devotes a chapter to addressing what I think is a fairly reasonable objection to his work, which is, if things are so much better, why do people seem to be so much less happy? I will say that I found this chapter fairly gross, since Pinker doesn't miss a single opportunity to say that people who are unhappy living in the global north or even suffering from mental health problems are just ungrateful. It's honestly a stunning failure to empathize with the misfortune of others and understand that not everyone has Steven Pinker's life. What do you have to complain about? We live in the best time to be alive. We get to be told how smart we are about linguistics. We can buy Mad Scientist brand conditioner. We can even fly around in a cool plane with a fun guy and his young massage friends. In this chapter, Pinker first tries to show that happiness does in fact neatly rise along with GDP. To do this, he cites quantitative data from happiness researchers, but there's a bit of a problem with this. First of all, there are studies that contradict the ones Pinker cites that show that the citizens of wealthier countries are no happier. Pinker relies on one study which does show a correlation between happiness and economic growth. However, for some reason, he doesn't include any of the criticisms that have been made about that study. But also, as Pinker discusses, data on happiness are collected by just asking people how happy they are.
How can a scientist measure something as subjective well-being? The best way to find out how happy people are is to ask them. Who could be a better judge? An old Saturday Night Live skit has Gilda Radner in a post-coital conversation with a nervous lover, played by Chevy Chase, who is worried she didn't have an orgasm. And she consoles him by saying, "Sometimes I do, and I don't even know it." We laugh because when it comes to subjective experience, the experiencer herself is the ultimate authority.
By the way, Pinker really loves dryly citing comedians to support his points, but they're always creeps like Chevy Chase, Louis C.K., or Woody Allen? I just wonder why that is. But Pinker's totally twisted sense of humor aside, as Sara Ahmed points out in her book The Promise of Happiness, this is a methodological problem with the study of happiness as a whole, since when we talk about happiness, we don't just mean feeling good, but generally think of being happy as synonymous with a well-lived life. As Ahmed writes,
if happiness is already understood to be what you want to have, then to be asked how happy you are is not to be asked a neutral question. It is not just that people are being asked to evaluate their life situations, but that they're being asked to evaluate their life situations through categories that are value-laden.
This also brings us to another issue with the rapidly growing field which studies happiness, often called positive psychology, or, if you'd prefer a more general and far cringier title, happinessology. Happinessologists, unsurprisingly, consider happiness to be the ultimate marker of success, and not just any old happiness, but a very specific brand of it. Ahmed writes,
positive psychology is positive about positive feeling. It presumes the promissory nature of its own object. To feel better is to be better. Happiness becomes a form of being directed or oriented, of following the right way. It is no accident that philosophers tend to find happiness in the life of the philosopher, or that thinkers tend to find happiness in the thinking of thought. Rather than assuming happiness is simply found in happy persons, we can consider how claims to happiness make certain forms of personhood valuable.
And so, bearing that in mind, let's ask ourselves exactly what kind of person is happiest. For this, let's turn to the great-granddaddy of objectively measuring happiness, Ruut Veenhoven, who, pushing back on the wishy-washy humanities notion that happiness is subjective, decided to attack the idea of happiness with facts and logic, conducting studies which came to this conclusion.
Happy persons are more likely to be found in the economically prosperous countries, whose freedom and democracy are held in respect and the political scene is stable. The happy are more likely to be found in majority groups than among minorities, and more often at the top of the ladder than at the bottom. They are typically married and get on well with families and friends. In respect of their personal characteristics, the happy appear relatively healthy, both physically and mentally. They are active and open-minded. They feel they are in control of their lives. Their aspirations concern social and moral matters rather than money-making. In matters of politics, the happy tend to the conservative side of middle.
Yeah, cool. Must be nice. This explains why rich white people have so much power. They're just naturally happier people. All the colonialism, slavery, and genocide is just a coincidence. It really all just comes down to winner mindset, baby. Now, we're going to come back to Sara Ahmed and questioning whether happiness is a good goal to have later on, but for now, I want to keep looking into different ways that we could measure happiness. In addition to hard numbers, Pinker also does a cursory vibe check of literature from other time periods.
Though no one gave happiness questionnaires to the people who lived in closely knit communities that were loosened by modernity, much of the great art composed during the transition brought to life their dark side. The provincialism, conformity, tribalism, and Taliban-like restrictions on women's autonomy. Many novels from the mid-18th to the early 20th century played out the struggles of individuals to overcome the suffocating norms of aristocratic, bourgeois, or rural regimes. Today we enjoy a world of personal freedom these characters could only fantasize about. A world in which people can marry, work, and live as they please. One can imagine a social critic of today warning Anna Karenina or Nora Helmer that a tolerant cosmopolitan society isn't all it's cracked up to be. I can't speak for them, but my guess is they think it was a pretty good deal.
Okay, I'm not alone in hating this guy's writing, right? Now, we're going to look into modern artistic trends too, and to do this, we're going to be using what is at least on its face, the most mushy, feels over reals school of analysis out there: affect theory. Affect theory is an analytic discipline that studies feelings, how they work, how we think of them, and what they are. It's sort of the science of vibes. As Warren Berlant, who actually tragically passed away very recently at the age of 63, notes, affect theory can be incredibly useful for analyzing the current moment. Like, for something like the Enlightenment, for example, since we have historical hindsight, it's a lot easier for us to look back and make sense of its causes, effects, who was involved, or if you're Steven Pinker, just make a bunch of shit up. But in the present moment, it's a lot harder to do those kinds of things. For instance, a lot of scholars think that we are now in the period of postmodernism, but since we're currently in the middle of that moment, it's very hard to say anything definite about it other than that it desperately needs a better name than postmodernism. This is where affect theory can be really useful, because one thing that we can know about the present historical period is how it feels. And how it feels is... What Berlant argued is that the affect that defines our current moment is what they called cruel optimism, and their explanation of this is just the best description of a toxic relationship that I've ever heard.
A relation of cruel optimism exists when something you desire is actually an obstacle to your flourishing. It might involve food or a kind of love. It might be a fantasy of the good life or a political project. It might rest on something simpler too, like a new habit that promises to induce in you an improved way of being. These kind of optimistic relations are not inherently cruel. They become cruel only when the object that draws your attachment actively impedes the aim that brought you to it initially.
An example of cruel optimism would be something like smoking. You might pick it up to fit in, but ultimately it winds up being an obstacle to that goal by causing you to die. And then no one wants to hang out at a party with the decomposing corpse. Guys, we all know every friend group has the decomposing corpse, and if you think yours doesn't, check your pulse because it's probably you. In their book, Cruel Optimism, Berlant argues that there's a relationship of cruel optimism between us and, for lack of a better term, the American dream. Berlant argues that that feeling of comes from us losing faith in the object of our optimism, the idea that just working hard and maybe getting a degree will be rewarded with a good life, but still holding on to the desire for that good life as advertised. Berlant asked what happens when, instead of placing our hope in new things, we instead remain attached to the old sources of optimism, even though we no longer have faith in them delivering a better life. Their conclusion was that we see the rise of new forms of media that focus on the instability and powerlessness which seems to dominate our modern world. Instead of an epic quest to defeat evil, for the heroes of these new modern stories, victory is characterized by just getting by. We can see another expression of cruel optimism in the anthropologist Gassan Hage's book Against Paranoid Nationalism, which, as a side note, in addition to being a really smart and well-written book, is also, much more importantly, really funny. Like, in the introduction, he writes,
2001 was a good year in Australia as far as opposition to racism is concerned, and 2002 is looking better. While not claiming to have investigated the matter empirically, my impression is that in 2001, a record number of Australians declared themselves to be opposed to the use of the terms racist and racism. Everywhere I turned, people were courageously stating things like, "I am not racist. That's not racism. I did not mention race, I am talking about culture." Or, "People will say I am racist, but I am not." And of course, to the delight of the connoisseurs, the famous, "I am not racist, but." So strongly do the anti-racists feel that if you ever refer to one of them as racist without their agreeing, they are likely to sue you. I've tried to get some people I think are racist to sign a contract agreeing that they are racist before I use a term to refer to them, but I have not succeeded so far. It is clear that they are dead set anti-racists.
In his book, Hage argues that society can be thought of as a mechanism that distributes hope to its citizens. He goes on to examine the ways that hope is then unequally distributed. He argues that society distributes hope in three ways: through group membership, through access to a social life, and most importantly for this video, through the promise of a future. An example of how cruel optimism fits into Hage's theories is in a talk Slavoj Žižek gave in London after being caught rifling through the compost in search of dinner. He discussed how the labor movement was unable to prevent the rise of Margaret Thatcher. Žižek argued that the left was unable to prevent the working class from voting for Thatcher because while they focused on economic inequalities, Thatcher was instead able to provide her voters with the fantasy, or as Hage would call it, hope, of a better future. Thatcher, racistly, argued that there was such a thing as a British character, and that anyone who had the British character had the potential for upward mobility. This promise of a better future was so powerful that it overrode the fact that her policies were directly responsible for worsening the lives of the very people who bought into it. One of the interesting observations Hage makes about this hope distribution system is why countries let in refugees. In addition to providing cheap labor, accepting refugees serves to legitimize a country by showing that they've produced so much hope that they can afford to give some away to the less fortunate. Hello and welcome to Kooky Crazy Canada, where we got so much of the good life, we don't even know what to do with it! So come on down and grab some premium hope while supplies last.
No, supplies are limited and not available to those who arrive via the Canada-United States border, have made a refugee claim in another country as confirmed through information sharing, are not admissible to Canada on security grounds or because of criminal activity or human rights violations, or made a previous refugee claim that was not found eligible. Results of good life may vary.
Coming back to Pinker now, I think this raises a good question about his book. What and who is Enlightenment now for? In Jason Hickel, one of Steven Pinker's biggest critics' book, The Divide, he mentions a well that was donated by the US in the West Bank of Palestine. The well features a big sign that says it's a gift from the American people, but Palestine doesn't need wells. Not really. Their water shortage comes from the fact that Israel, with the support of the US, takes about 90% of Palestine's water for settlements and won't let Palestinians deepen their wells to get at what water is left. The well and the sign aren't there to help Palestinians. They're there for Americans to feel good knowing their government has produced so much hope that they can give a little away for free. Pinker's work serves a very similar purpose: to deliver hope to justify neoliberal capitalism, not for those most negatively affected by it, but those enjoying its rewards. Like giving a copy of Enlightenment now to someone living on $2 a day, expecting them to be cheered up by the fact that crime in America has been decreasing since the 90s, is straight up serial killer shit. And Pinker is explicit about this.
If you're reading this, you are not dead, starving, destitute, moribund, terrified, enslaved, or illiterate, which means that you're in no position to turn your nose up at these values.
Oh my god, he admitted. So, if being happy and optimistic is a scam, what should we do? Well, one thing that's nice is that if we're going to be miserable, at least we have some pretty rad company. Sara Ahmed points out that most progressive movements have fought against what was viewed as happiness at the time. She points to the stereotypes of the feminist killjoy and the angry black lady as representatives of groups who fought against views of happiness in favor of equality. Another example is the struggle for queer liberation, which has fought to eke out an alternative to the vision of happiness that is the domestic bliss of the traditional nuclear family. Another thing that Ahmed points out is the concept of flow state, that feeling when you stop thinking and lose yourself entirely in what you're doing, very common with athletes and gamers, neither of which are welcome on my channel. The concept of flow state comes up a lot in the study of happiness. Many people who write about flow state describe it as the best moments of our lives, when instead of passively relaxing or being in our own heads observing the world, experiencing it as something other and in opposition to us, instead, in flow state, we're actively engaging as a part of the world and losing ourselves in something we're good at. The problem with this, though, is that the world is in opposition to certain types of people more so than others. As Ahmed writes,
when the subjects are not in flow, they encounter the world as resistant, as blocking rather than enabling an action. Unhappy subjects hence feel alienated from the world as they experience the world as alien. What if to flow into the world is not simply understood as a psychological attribute? What if the world houses some bodies more than others, such that some bodies do not experience that world as resistant?
Ahmed, drawing on the work of Frantz Fanon, notes that an unhappiness with the status quo and awareness that the world is in opposition to you, preventing you from flowing, is a key component to the development of revolutionary consciousness. Not only that, but for those on the margins, the realization that there is something wrong with the world, which they have been alienated by, allows them to build solidarity with others who don't fit with the world as it is either. Instead of optimistic for the future, Ahmed suggests, as my fucking boy Frederick Jameson wrote, we should be anxious at the prospect of losing our future. This is different from pessimism, since it doesn't mean resigning ourselves to misery, but rather believing there is the potential for a future worth living out there, if we're able to fight for it. Thanks for watching.
Looking down the barrel of our shitty future, throwing back whatever we can to avoid the dread of what's been said, but there's just no escaping it. Trying to find the words to explain what it feels like, bugging out like, wait, did I say something weird? But that is just the price of faking like we're innocent. Chasing bliss, chasing chasing bliss is only numbing it. Looking for a dream that won't morph to a nightmare, lying to myself about things that I love, 'cause I'm distracted by public displays of happiness. So I scour the internet for a new pair of Nike status symbol shit that I say I'm above disown control. Oh no, I'm fucking full of shit. Stinking rage, hypocrite. No, it's not.